Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will now go to Mr. Erskine-Smith.
Thanks very much, Minister, for being here. I also appreciate your support before you were Minister for C-246. I want to ask, your home province of Quebec has recognized that animals are sentient. I want to get at some of the general principles for why we want to protect animals in the criminal code. And you noted in your comments that animals are oftentimes an important part of our family. And would you agree that animals are sentient?
The evidence that I have seen, I think, is increasingly going in that direction. I'm not an expert. I can only base it on what I read. So to the extent that I have seen the same kinds of studies that you have, it seems to me that that's where the scientific evidence is going.
And in terms of the moral wrong that we're aiming to address in the criminal code, is it a crime to cause unnecessary pain and suffering to animals because they're sentient, they think and feel and can suffer pain, or is it because they're the property of someone else?
It's a larger question, and I think that question needs to be addressed as part of our ongoing look at these provisions generally. We've committed to that. My predecessor committed to that. I'm happy to commit to the same thing moving forward. I certainly am quite open to reforming all of the provisions generally, but that will take time, and it will take time precisely because of the questions that you're raising, important scientific questions and important ethical questions about our relationship to animals.
I think it gets to the bottom of what do we want the criminal code to look like in terms of protecting animals, and that will depend upon the first principles of what do we want to protect in the first place. And I think it's important when we know, and the evidence is that animals can think, feel, love, and suffer, our laws should reflect that reality. So there have been previous attempts by former Liberal justice ministers to introduce significant reform to the criminal code with respect to animal cruelty provisions. Justice Minister Anne McClellan, Justice Minister Martin Cochon, Justice Minister Irwin Cotler. These three previous attempts were more substantive than C-84. Do you think C-84 is sufficient?
No, I think it was made clear by my predecessor, and I think it was made clear in my opening remarks that we have in C-84 picked two areas where there's widespread agreement, and we could get it done now. We were filling a gap in one case, and we are addressing a practice in another case, animal fighting, that we don't want to see. Agree that there are larger, deeper ethical questions, legal questions that really do go to the heart of the way in which we envisage society and our relationship to ourselves, amongst ourselves, as well as to animals, and those are larger questions that need to be addressed.
And it's fair to say then that this is a first step. I would say a fairly modest first step if I'm being generous, but this is a first step, and that as Justice Minister you're committing to additional consultations and to doing more where those consultations find some consensus and find a way forward.
Yeah, as my predecessor also stated, we're going to keep moving forward with this dialogue and literally try to make our criminal code and our society better.
So in keeping with that theme of additional consultations, I want to read a letter from November 22nd, 2004. And it says, Canada's animal-based sectors, as represented by the undersigned, wish to express our support for the swift passage of certain amendments to the Criminal Code, cruelty to animals provisions. Specifically, we are calling for the reintroduction and adoption of the measures contained in C-22. Now, that was signed by over 25 animal use groups, including the Canadian Cattlemen's Association and the Dairy Farmers of Canada. It was not signed by the Canadian Federation of Agriculture, but CFA did note their dismay when similar measures didn't pass into law. So it seems to me there was significant consensus in 2004 amongst animal use groups to be more bold and to do more for animals in the criminal code. And do you think, with sufficient work on your part, that you can get back to that consensus?
Look, I'm not going to speak about a consensus that happened in 2004. I wasn't privy to those discussions. I was, quite frankly, doing other things at the time, and so I'm not fully versed on all of those various discussions that happened in 2004. What I will commit to doing is keeping dialogue open with various groups, including a number of the groups that you've mentioned. I know that they have weighed in on this particular piece of legislation, and they're supportive. And we'll continue to be open to all people who have an opinion on the matter.
My last question, just to pick up on that point of dialogue. So this committee is going to be engaged in a few meetings of study and legislative review of a bill that is effectively one page and addresses two very narrow issues in the criminal code. And it's an important bill in the sense that it addresses a Supreme Court ruling of some note, as my colleague from the Conservative Party addressed. But it doesn't allow for a broad conversation at a committee like this. It doesn't allow for a multitude of stakeholders to come in and not just talk about these two provisions in the criminal code, but say, how do we as a society better protect animals across this country? And so do you think it would be more productive in terms of dialogue to have a committee like this, whether it's the Justice Committee or a special all-parliamentary committee devoted to animal protections, to say, let's bring in witnesses across the country. We as parliamentarians, it doesn't matter what party we're from, we care about ending animal cruelty, and to see what consensus we can forge to then introduce a new bill that would potentially do more for animals based upon significant consensus, based upon a larger dialogue that could take place at a parliamentary committee. Do you think that would be a productive way forward?
My immediate priority is the passage of this legislation. It is important. The two practices that are identified in this piece of legislation are important to prohibit and define in each respective case. I'm open to discussing other ways forward.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.